Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of history's most spectacular failures, a 17th century warship whose story has become a timeless lesson in what happens when people are just too afraid to speak up.
Okay, so let's get right into it. You know, when you see the actual salvaged wreck of the Vasa today, you can't help but ask yourself that exact question. This isn't really a story about a sunken ship, is it? It's about people. It's about human dynamics, and it's this mystery that, believe it or not, still plays out in workplaces almost 400 years later.
I mean, it's just incredible. The end came almost before the journey even began. We're talking about the most expensive, most powerful, most decorated ship in the entire Swedish Royal Navy, and it barely made it out of the harbor. The whole thing was over in a flash, and everyone was watching.
All right, so let's set the scene. What actually happened on that fateful day in Stockholm? Because the details of how it sank, well, that's our first big clue to the much deeper problems that were hiding just beneath the surface.
So picture this. It's her maiden voyage. There are crowds everywhere, dignitaries, foreign spies, you name it. The Vasa sets sail. It travels about 1,300 meters, just under a mile, and then a gust of wind hits. And we're not talking about a storm here. This was barely a breeze. But that's all it took. The ship just heeled over. Water rushed in through the open gun ports on the lower deck, and that was it. Within minutes, she was at the bottom of the harbor. The captain? He survived, but he was immediately thrown in jail, and you can bet a formal inquiry started right away.
So how does a gentle wind sink a massive warship? Well, to get that, we have to rewind a bit and look at the crazy amount of pressure this whole project was under, and it was all coming from the very top. See, this ship wasn't just another boat for the Navy. Oh no, this was a massive statement of royal power and ambition.
This whole project was basically a textbook case of what we'd now call scope creep, but on a royal scale. King Gustavus Adolphus was locked in this huge naval arms race. So first, he's like, build it faster. He demands an accelerated schedule. Then, he gets word that his rivals, the Danes, are building a ship with 2 gun decks. So what does he do? He orders the Vasa, which is already being built, mind you, to be enlarged to match. This was something no one in Sweden had ever even tried before.
So, you can probably guess what happens next. This constant pressure, these last-minute massive changes, they led to a whole series of critical, compounding flaws getting baked right into the ship's DNA.
I mean, just look at the difference between the plan and what actually got built. It's night and day. To jam in that second gun deck, they literally had to extend the keel after it was already laid down. They widened the hole, sure, but mostly at the top, making it top-heavy. And then that new upper deck, which should have had lighter cannons, got loaded up with massive, heavy 24-pounders. And the craziest part? All of these changes were made without any formal blueprints or calculations. They were just winging it.
And it just gets worse. The problems just kept piling on top of each other. The experienced master shipwright, he dies halfway through the project. His less experienced assistant has to take over. You've got 400 people from 5 different teams all working on this thing with almost no coordination. And then, as if it wasn't top-heavy enough, they slapped on hundreds of huge, heavy oak carvings way up high on the ship, all for decoration. It was a recipe for disaster.
And get this, when they finally pulled the wreck out of the harbor in 1961, they found one of the core problems. The ship wasn't even symmetrical. One side was thicker than the other. Why? It turns out the building crews were using 4 different kinds of rulers based on 2 completely different systems of measurement. I mean, could you ask for a more perfect metaphor for what was wrong? Everyone was working on the same project, but they weren't even measuring it the same way.
Okay, so this is where the story goes from being about a simple, albeit massive, mistake to a real tragedy. The disaster wasn't just predictable. They knew. They actually saw it happen right before the launch.
So just before the big maiden voyage, an admiral decides to run a stability test. It's pretty simple. He gets 30 sailors to run back and forth across the top deck to see how much it rolls. They run across 1, 2, 3 times, and the ship starts rocking so violently that the admiral literally has to scream, "Stop!" He was afraid it was going to flip over right there at the dock. So, yeah, they knew there was no question it was unstable.
And this quote from the admiral, "If only the king were here," it just says everything, doesn't it? At that point, the ship's flaws were built in. There was no easy fix, but the project was already way behind schedule.
So the admiral is caught in this impossible position. Does he delay the launch and face the king's fury, which he knows is coming, or does he roll the dice and hope for the best at sea? He chose to risk disaster. The culture of fear was just that powerful. Nobody, absolutely nobody, felt like they could be the one to tell the king the bad news.
So here's the real takeaway. The Vasa didn't sink just because it was top-heavy. That was a symptom. It sank because of a completely dysfunctional organizational culture. And this exact pattern of failure, well, it's so common that we actually have a name for it now. It's called Vasa syndrome, and it describes this exact situation. When the people on the ground, the ones doing the work, the ones who know there are problems, when they feel like they can't speak up. They're afraid of the consequences, there's too much pressure from the top. So these hidden flaws, these latent flaws, they just stay there, uncorrected, and the project keeps moving forward, sailing straight for disaster.
Just look at this checklist. It's a perfect storm. You've got goal confusion, with the king changing the plans. You've got an obsession with speed, a total breakdown in the feedback system. Bad news had nowhere to go but down. Communication barriers between teams. No one writing down the changes. The king constantly meddling. Every single one of these was a factor for the Vasa. It was a blueprint for failure. And you know what the final inquiry found? No single person was to blame. They couldn't pin it on anyone.
But here's the final powerful piece of the story, because it shows that the knowledge needed to prevent this whole thing, it wasn't some big secret. It was already there, inside the team.
Remember the shipwright who took over, Hein Jacobsen? He already suspected the Vasa's design was dangerously narrow. So after the Vasa goes down, he gets the job to build its sister ship, the Applet. And what does he do? He makes one critical change. He just builds it about a meter wider. That's it. And the Applet? It served proudly in the Swedish Navy for 30 years. So the lesson was learned, but only after a huge, public, and deadly failure.
And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? The Vasa sank because the people who knew something was wrong felt like they couldn't speak up. It makes you wonder who needs to hear your concerns today. Because creating a place where it's safe to share bad news, where you can raise a red flag without fear, that's not just some soft management skill. As the Vasa shows us, it can be the difference between a 30-year success and a disaster that sinks in less than half an hour.